Okay, I think we'll get going now because we've got over 160 participants here, which is fantastic. I'm sure there'll be more that will join shortly. So let's get going. Yeah, first of all, morning. It's fantastic to see so many of you guys engaging with us today. That's a brilliant turnout. Really heartwarming and impressed to see those numbers. So thank you very much. Today's webinar is going to be about the changing face of construction industry. My name's Christian. I'm just doing a quick intro and I'll shortly be handing over to Daniel Storr, who'll talk you through everything. The webinar is going to include such things as the recession, economical changes, government initiatives, modern methods of construction, and a bit more just generally about Thistle Underwriting. So just a bit about Thistle. Thistle is Q Underwriting's liability specialist insurance provider. Daniel manages our high risk and large construction team based out of Leeds. So he is the fountain of knowledge, and I'm sure you'll find this webinar really useful. Please feel free to ask us some questions as we go through. There's a Q&A box at the bottom where you can type in your questions and answers, and we'll have a little section at the end where we go through that Q&A. So feel free to put them in as we go through the webinar today. So there'll also be a write-up at the end of this, with a link to a recording of the webinar, and if you can share that with your colleagues wherever it's useful, we'd be really appreciative. And if we don't get to any of your questions, then we'll follow up with that afterwards in that write-up. So that's it from me. I'll hand you over to the capable hands of Daniel. And once again, thanks a lot for joining.
Thanks, Christian, and thank you everybody for joining, and welcome to today's webinar. As Christian said, my name is Daniel Storr. I'm the underwriting manager construction for the Thistle Leeds team. We look after large construction and high-risk contractors. And many of you may be familiar with me and some of my colleagues because we've recently done a series of videos that highlights who we are and what we do. I just want to move firstly, before we move into the content, into some learning objectives. So our physical workplace may be an office in Leeds, but we focus exclusively on construction, and we actively engage with a UK-wide network of brokers, and we feel that allows us to get a real strong sense of what's going on in the sector. So what I am about to share is drawn from research, but also from cases discussed with colleagues and interesting risks presented by brokers. And what I am about to share may only have temporary relevance. Our society is changing, and if what I had prepared had been presented on Monday, then it already might be out of date. So I hope to be able to meet the following learning objectives in today's webinar: to raise awareness of developments in the construction sector, to highlight the possible implications for contractors and their insurance arrangements, and to highlight how Thistle Underwriting is responding to the changes. So we will look at a number of current issues facing the construction sector. We will look at a number of specific sectors, we will look at a number of trades, and we will highlight the Thistle Underwriting appetite and how we are responding to these changes. And our focus will be on the main lines of business that are written by Thistle Underwriting, and that's liability, CAR, and plant. And we're all living through many of these developments, and to some extent, all I can do is speculate about the implications. Many changes do prompt further questions, and there may not be definitive answers. Your construction clients will be facing a level of uncertainty. And a higher level of awareness should allow us all as insurance professionals to stand in their shoes and show why they should trust us to create the right insurance solutions. So just before we get into the technical side of things, I thought I'd share something that I found interesting recently, so I'm hoping you'll also find it interesting. So I've described today's learning objectives. I hope you will learn something new today and that the learning objectives will be satisfied. And this image here reminds me of a new piece of knowledge that I recently acquired. So here we have all the British coins with a face value less than £1. And this is what cash looks like. And in our recent contactless world, we may not have seen much of it. But placed side by side in this formation, we have the Royal Shield of Arms. So why am I showing this? Well, these coins have been around for many years, with this design introduced over 10 years ago. And most of us will be familiar with the British currency. So in this webinar, we metaphorically dig into our pockets and look more closely at what many of us may see every day. We may learn something new, or we may be assured that our level of knowledge is to a high standard. And it's a shield, a cover that protects whatever is behind or beneath it, a bit like the insurance policies we provide and arrange on behalf of our our construction clients. And it's money. And within this webinar, we will look at something we just can't avoid, and that's the economy. So let's start with the Planning for the Future consultation. And this was launched by the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government fairly recently, August 2020, with a consultation running to the end of October 2020. And this is a consultation that's focused on England. So the consultation addresses the planning system, one that has long been criticised for being too sluggish in providing housing and too ineffectual in obligating developers to properly fund the infrastructure, such as schools and roads, to support them. Now that's a government view, and it's not one that is universally held. But under the proposals, all land in England will be designated for either growth, that has automatic planning permission, renewal, that's permission subject to some basic checks, or protection, and that's to preserve the status of the green belt. So green spaces and green belt will have protection, with the reforms allowing for more building on brownfield land. And the reforms will support the government goal to deliver 300,000 new homes a year by the mid-2020s. That is a big increase, as data for England for the final quarter of 2019 shows just over 150,000 new build dwelling starts in the whole of 2019. So we can see from that that a significant increase in house building is required. And some of you may be aware of this consultation. You may even have a view on the desirability of these reforms, and you may be contributing feedback to the consultation. This might affect you personally. You may be resident in an area where development needs to be controlled. And ideally, development should only be undertaken where there is community consent. Some commentators have highlighted countries where similar planning reforms have resulted in substandard housing and unfinished and abandoned housing estates. So the Planning for the Future consultation and the government New Homes goal suggests a focused attempt to increase the number of dwellings being built. The government vow to build, build, build is a core initiative to help Britain bounce back from the pandemic. And CBI research shows that every £1 spent on UK construction creates £2.92 of value to the UK. And all this is likely to benefit smaller developers. The current system could be considered unfavourable to small businesses, and that's justified by statistics which show the proportion of new home building they lead on dropping drastically from 40% 30 years ago to just 12% today. So what are the insurance implications? Well, I think it would be reasonable to expect more activity in the sector, and that means increases in financial estimates and increased premiums. I also think we will see an increase in the number of developers and builders in the new PDH sector and complementary trades such as site preparation. And for new ventures, underwriters are likely to look more closely at director and senior manager competence. New housing estates may result in larger contract values and longer contract periods, so it's worth checking that works limits are adequate, and that's something we'll come back to later in the presentation. Most definitely, a high proportion of work will be let to bona fide subcontractors, so we all need to be ensuring that bona fide selection practices and record keeping align with policy conditions. There will be an increased demand for skilled tradespeople, and that may exhaust the current supply. And that may result in less skilled operatives being brought into the sector, with resultant health and safety challenges and a reduced build quality. So I say there, speculative building, check the clause. And simplistically, more experience in this sector allows for good site selection, high build quality, and setting the right sale price. And those are all key factors to ensuring that houses are sold quickly and within the period allowed by the speculative development clause. And those popular builders, I would suggest those that are building with the consent of the community, and who have a good local reputation, are likely to sell houses more quickly. But for new ventures, for inexperienced, for fast-growing businesses, you may need to maintain regular contact with your clients to measure progress on their developments. And then if the commentators are correct, the ones who've talked about abandoned sites and poor build quality, then poor build quality perhaps will mean that insurers will have more defects claims. If sites are suspended, then suspension of works clause may become more relevant and invoked more frequently. And if sites are abandoned, then they may be purchased by another developer, adding a requirement for existing structures requirements. So let's look at the Thistle underwriting appetite. And in this area, the Thistle underwriting appetite is very strong. So these smaller developers who are supported by the consultation, typically up to 15 million annual turnover, are right in the heart of our underwriting appetite. But we also like some of the very nice complementary trades. So ground workers involved in site preparation for new housing estates, I would absolutely love to see more of those. And we have flexibility tailored to the needs of house builders, where generally larger limits and longer contract periods may be required. Just let me get rid of something that's appeared on the screen. We also do have a general acceptance of bona fide subcontractor biased risks, and that's something that we find is extremely common for new house building. So that draws me to the end of the section about planning for the future. And at this point, I'm going to ask for some audience engagement. So we're going to launch our first poll. So if you can please look at the question, which says, do you expect to see an increase in house building activity? And this is your opinion I'm seeking. So I've given some information there, but I'm looking for your feedback. 15 to 20 seconds we'll run this poll. Do you expect to see an increase in house building activity, yes or no? Okay, so we have the answers there. That's really good. Thank you, everybody. So we've got there, yes, 88% and no, 12%. So that's very encouraging. You know, a lot of our development as Thistle Underwriting is based around growth in house building, a target trade with complementary trades, very attractive business for us. We want to write more of it. So it's good that we're all on the same page in relation to that. And thank you for your contribution to that poll. There will be more polls during the course of the webinar as well, so more opportunity for engagement. We move on now to the economy, and after the biggest downturn on record, the country has still recovered only around half of the output lost between February and May. So let's look at some of the key sectors and the more general economic issues that impact on construction. And we'll start by looking at some of the sectors of the economy that are facing many challenges. So firstly, just some headlines about retail. I believe the impact on retail has been significant. In the first week of September, the number of people visiting high streets and shopping centres remained a little below 75% of last year's level. More of us are shopping online, and we've seen major UK retail chains closing stores. So what we expect there is fewer stores to refurbish and reduced budgets for maintenance and refurbishment. And it's not across the whole of the retail sector, because I feel that there are exceptions. Exceptions would be supermarkets and discount retailers. And there are some similarities across hospitality as well, with a sector under pressure, major UK casual dining chains closing sites, again, fewer sites to refurbish, reduced budgets for maintenance and refurbishment. And the final challenging sector that I've picked out here is the office, the place where some of us might be now, or the place where some of us might not be, because we're working from home. And there is much speculation about the future of the office as home working does increase and working patterns change. So we could expect less demand for bricks and mortar offices and lower capacity requirements. And all that suggests, in simple terms, that shop fitters, office fitters, and other contractors who rely heavily on these sectors may be under some financial pressure. But then I've picked out some areas where there may be a degree of prosperity. So public v private sector. So it appears to me that central government commitments and spending pledges mean that contractors connected to markets where public money is being spent will feel confident about the future. Public money will be used to stimulate the economy. And this may contrast slightly for those contractors who work more closely with local government. Local budgets may be stretched, resulting in revised, i.e. scaled back, maintenance programs. And then there's a sector which I've decided to call logistics online wholesale, a sector that might be characterized by online retailers and those connected industries where business is expanding. And they have slightly different premises requirements, requiring large sheds strategically located to ensure efficient distribution. And then the final area that might be prospering is infrastructure, one that's been less affected by the pandemic than other construction sectors. And that's because it benefits from clients keen to continue with work and projects such as road building and maintenance, where it's easier to enact social distancing measures. And infrastructure output has recently returned to higher than pre-pandemic levels. The government has promised a massive building programme to put jobs and infrastructure at the centre of economic growth strategy. So all that means good news for contractors in this sector. So I just want to look a little bit more closely at the last two prospering sectors. And if we start, as I say, it's that sector which I've decided to call logistics online wholesale, which hopefully means something to all of us. So I believe that the Thistle Underwriting appetite in this sector is very strong. And these are a number of trades that I think are connected with the development of logistics online wholesale type premises, those very specific premises requirements. So I've got here structural steel erectors, builders specialising in industrial buildings, cladding contractors, ground workers specialising in roads, car parks and foundations, mobile crane hire, safety netting contractors, shelving and racking contractors, fire protection, both passive and sprinkler installers, and specialists in mechanical and automated handling systems. I just want to touch on those last two in a little bit more detail, just to highlight a couple of elements of our appetite and factors that are specific to those two trades. So for passive fire protection contractors, So somebody there doing coating of steel framework with incandescent paints, we will consider efficacy cover for passive fire protection contractors. And then you've got specialists in mechanical and automated handling systems. And we have seen examples of these trades expanding as more businesses seek automated solutions to support social distancing. And we've also seen a high demand from mainland Europe for UK specialists. So if you are looking to place these risks, you may need to ensure that your insurer can accept work outside the UK, and that's something that Thistle Underwriting can do. So moving on to infrastructure and our target trades there. And again, our appetite is very strong, and we'll quote for the following trades connected to the infrastructure sector. So we've got road construction and maintenance, ground workers, utility contractors, white lining contractors, street lining contractors, traffic management contractors. And then we move into bridges, rail and tunnels, where it really is a case of discussion on each individual case. So it's areas where we can provide cover, but it's very much specific to the individual risk circumstances. So please do contact us if you have risks of that type. And then looking at the economy in more general terms. So if we build to boost the economy, then parts of the construction sector may have some immunity to recessionary impacts, but that immunity will not apply to everyone. And there are two potential scenarios. So let's look at, firstly, the implications of a recession. And when we as insurers think about a recession, we may be concerned about the following. So reduced maintenance of property, reduced training of employees, a reduction in non-productive roles, for example, health and safety advisors, lower standards of record keeping, which does compromise claims defensibility, decisions based on cost, with cutthroat bidding to get a slice of a smaller cake. Employees may feel less loyal and therefore more likely to claim, and there may be the development of a compensation culture which encourages more claims. And then there are fewer options to involve other contractors to share the cost of the claim. So that might mean an increase in the volume of claims, in the cost of claims, and difficulties in defending claims, and possibly with increases in premiums for risks using bona fide subcontractors. And we'll develop those last 2 points in a little bit more detail. So thinking about an employer's liability claim, most sites will consist of a patchwork of employers, principals, main contractors, consultants, subcontractors, employees, etc. And when an employee is injured, a claim may be brought against several parties. And if some of these parties have ceased trading, and that's a common feature in a recession, then the options to share the claim are reduced. And then from a public liability perspective, you probably wouldn't need to spend long in the company of the Thistle Underwriting team before you heard the question, what's the right premium to charge for a risk which is biased towards bona fide subcontractors? And perhaps we see a number of insurers shying away from these risks, but they are acceptable to Thistle Underwriting. Most of them should give an insurer confidence that when the bona fide condition is complied with and selection criteria are robust, there are reasonable prospects of recovery from bona fide subcontractors. But in a recession, a number of bona fides may go out of business, and they may have cover in place when the work is done for our insured, but when the claim occurs, remembering that PL is a claims occurring basis, they may have cancelled their policy or ceased trading. So there may be a shift in pricing with risks that have a high reliance on bona fide subcontractors, and that might include some of the new build PDH risks that we spoke about earlier, seeing increases in premium. So that's the recessionary side. What about the reverse of that? So when in growth mode, we may see difficulties managing health and safety for those businesses that grow quickly. We might see challenges inducting new employees from outside the construction sector. and we might see businesses retaining older employees who may present additional considerations for health and safety. And there are just a few interesting points about older employees. So CITB research shows that a third of construction workers, and that's 765,000 people, are aged 50 or older. Our own experience, when we look at some of our larger EL claims, we do see a large number involving employees who are working beyond normal retirement age. And then we overlay that with some recently published HSE statistics, and they show that occupational deaths in the age 60 plus category equate to 27% of the total number of fatalities. And that's in contrast to this category constituting just 10% of the total workforce. Now, the reasons why employees might be working beyond normal retirement age might include, personal financial circumstances. But perhaps now employees who are above current retirement age are reconsidering their options and deciding that they may have a vulnerability to COVID, and we might see a reduction in the number in the workplace. But there's a lot happening there with the different age profile of the UK workforce, and I do feel that is something that insurers might need to look at in more detail. So what happens when a business does prosper? Top line growth, that might be a sign of prosperity. But we'll look at this a bit later as well. Many may find profit margins are eroded because costs are increased, and that's due to measures such as social distancing. And that might result in an increased focus then on cost cutting, which means that they then have similar factors to those who are feeling recessionary pressure. Okay, so that ends that particular section on the economy, and that means it's time for another poll. So again, it's a choice of two. What do you expect in construction? Growth and prosperity, or challenges and contraction? So we're asking you to make a simple choice between those two, and the poll will run for the next 20 seconds. Okay, so closer than the first poll, with the audience slightly siding with the challenges and contraction. So, it's an interesting one. It's one to keep an eye on, and it may well change on a regular basis according to how we are dealing with the pandemic and the type of steps that can be put in place, not just for contractors, but for the customers of contractors as well. So, thank you very much for sharing your thoughts on that one, and then we'll move on to the next section, which is looking at coronavirus, the changes that are taking place and how the construction sector is adapting. And one thing to bear in mind is the construction sector is an ecosystem, so site activity may be different, but contractors rely on a common supply chain of merchants and manufacturers to deliver, and they in turn rely on demand from contractors. And there is a fine balance of competitive tendering and operating to profitable margins. And in normal times, those profit margins within construction are notoriously thin. And all that can be disrupted when there is unpredictability. You've got economic instability, you've got an unreliable supply chain, and you've got possible labour shortages. And recently we have seen supply shortages for certain materials. And one example would be plasterboard. And shortages there may be due to manufacturers closing their production lines when they followed COVID-19 government guidelines, but also due to other factors. So furloughed staff and home workers may have felt that it was the right time to engage in some DIY projects at home. And there are also priority projects such as Nightingale hospitals. And right now, UK manufacturing is generally not back to pre-COVID levels. And future production may be impacted, and we've seen this in the last 24 hours, by practical issues, implementing safe workplaces, local lockdowns, employees in isolation, and site restrictions. And then there is further unpredictability around Brexit, where businesses are unable to accurately predict the prices and costs of materials and goods that originate from the EU after the 1st of January 2021. And it's not always possible to source everything from within the UK. So because of that, tender prices might have to increase, longer contract periods may be required, and that has implications for CAR cover. And I do believe that it's a really good time now to review CAR policy wordings to ensure the implications of original estimated contract price and maximum period any one contract are fully understood. And this is a wording that's found on some CAR policies. So the insurer excludes any contract which involves an original estimated contract price and or an original contract period in excess of that shown in the schedule. And I do believe in this uncertain environment, your clients may be starting contracts that are completely excluded by their current insurer. And to give an example, the schedule shows $1 million, the schedule shows 12 months. But the unpredictability that we've described earlier means that when a new contract is tendered, what may have been £1 million 12 months ago when there was certainty now becomes 1.1 million. And once that contract is started, there is no cover. So the contractor has successfully managed all those challenges. They've balanced competitive tendering whilst operating to profitable margins, and they've done all that in an uncertain trading environment. But then the big sting in the tail as the contract is completely excluded by their current policy. So it's worth highlighting that these restrictions do not apply to the Thistle Contractors Combined policy. We write works on a first loss limit of liability basis. Maximum contract period is a rating factor, not a limitation. And your contractor would be covered under our policy. The only restriction is the limit of liability shown in the policy. So that's a better position to be in. No cover with one insurer, up to £1 million with Thistle. And then another area where we're helping you to tackle uncertainty. So most contractors' premiums are set by asking each insured to make a projection, acting in good faith, of activity over the next 12 months. So that's an estimate of wages, labour only subcontractor payments, bona fide payments, contracting turnover and hiring charges. That's a long-standing practice for liability and CAR insurers, but right now that feels a very difficult exercise for many contractors. And there appear to be two practices adopted by insurers. Option A, M&D, or minimum deposit, which can have a number of specific interpretations. So we think it means no rebate if you overestimate and no return premium if you cancel midterm. That appears slightly unfair when construction activity is subject to the challenges we've talked about. You then move to option B, declaration, and this is the Thistle standard. So premiums based on estimates, as you would expect, but adjusted at the year end once the actuals are known. And if the insured has been over optimistic in their estimates, then a rebate is given up to 25%. And we think that's a fair and reasonable approach to insuring contractors. And our policy for large contractors, which is called our Construction Combined, is written on that basis. So back to coronavirus and how are sites operating? Well, there's recently been published a Loughborough University report. It was published August 2020, titled COVID-19 in Construction, Early Lessons for a New Normal. And there's some very promising signs from the research that was done across 5 sites. So all sites had increased the time spent planning work and tasks. And this resulted in improved work sequencing, allocating only one trade at a time to an area. And that makes it more obvious who was left waste behind, and enforcement is therefore easier. We saw a carefully planned system with fewer workers and fewer materials, and that should result in improved tidiness and housekeeping. There were clearer and better marked walkways and one-way systems were in place. And planning ensured that materials were not delivered before they were needed. So this could benefit employers, all those on site, and insurers, because a safer working environment with fewer slip and trip hazards and clearer accountability if things do go wrong. And generally, there were fewer workers on site at any one time. One project introduced a second shift, and one site used off-site manufacture, which we'll come back to later, to reduce the need for workers to be in close proximity. Another had workers staggering their start times, reducing the need to queue for site access or changing rooms. All sites made changes to how they carried out induction in response to COVID-19. There was a general perception that induction was improved, for example, briefing of smaller groups. And good induction procedures, backed up by evidence and enforcement to ensure compliance, should improve overall site safety and claims defensibility. And main contractors and subcontractors were seen to be working together. So for example, subcontractors were checking that sites were safe for their workers to return to, whilst main contractors were requiring subcontractors to demonstrate they had suitable COVID secure work plans in place. Now, whilst these practices may be centred very specifically around COVID, and they may fade as society finds ways to live with the virus and the initial shock of COVID wanes, they may also become embedded as new habits that improve the overall culture of health and safety. And the research did find that working this way is likely to take longer and might extend programme times. So that's a factor we've already considered. Still worth a reminder, maximum contract periods will need to be reviewed. So we're ready for another poll. And there it is. So we talked about two options, M&D, minimum deposit, and declaration. And we're giving the option here to express which option your clients would prefer. And you can also prefer not to stay if you wish. So again, 20 seconds to run through this poll. Okay, so pretty positive in terms of declaration. I think that's good. I'm pleased to see that. We think it's good for clients. I think the follow-up to this, it would be great to hear from many of you and to talk about declaration in more detail when we quote them for individual risks. So that's declaration, the winner with 85%. So many thanks for your feedback there, everybody. So moving into modern methods of construction. Here's a question, what is MMC? And you're not going to get an answer actually from me today because there are many definitions and it really depends on who you're talking to. So within Thistle, we see MMC embracing a range of off-site manufacturing and on-site techniques that provide alternatives to traditional building. And what we see is MMC generally focused on house building, but it is also relevant to commercial. And traditional, what's traditional? Well, I believe traditional would be building houses from bricks with timber floors and roofs covered in tiles. Modern methods, that would be something like prefabricated wall panels arriving on site to be tilted up into place, or modular units lifted and lowered into place. These modular units are shown in these images and are the most obvious form of MMC that we have seen. Three-dimensional units ranging from a basic structure only to one with all internal and external finishes and services installed, all ready for installation. And MMC generally involves high volume manufacturing and partial assembly in factories, and then transporting those constructed parts to the site to be installed. And factories are very controlled environments, easily monitored, not only for quality of build, but also generally for the welfare of employees and staff. And those workplaces may allow for easier implementation of a COVID-safe environment. And they may also allay some of our concerns over older employees when these factories perhaps offer them a safer working environment whilst utilising the vast knowledge they hold. Projects which utilise MMC do generally require fewer people on site and less time spent there. And again, this reduction in numbers on site helps COVID compliance. MMC therefore sidesteps a number of the practical issues that developers may otherwise face. We've already described challenges around shortages of materials, and currently many modular units are built abroad. So if MMC is a solution to COVID challenges, then the supply chain needs to be reliable, and that requires more factories in the UK to secure production and increase confidence in the use of MMC. And there are also practical benefits as transportation mileage is reduced, so a reduced risk whilst in transit. Now, these manufacturing facilities are often operated by non-contracting firms, but contractors may create flying factories, sometimes referred to as field factories. And these are temporary facilities used to manufacture prefabricated components. They are located close to the site or even on the site, and they're different from conventional off-site factories in that they only operate for the duration of a project and are then closed, and operations may then fly to a new location to service another project. So when we see flying factories, which is actually very, very rare at present, they tend to be connected to MMC risks. Now, MMC is already with us, but there's a general belief that COVID may represent a watershed moment when the supporters of MMC have a platform, the benefits become clearer, and it starts to become more widely adopted. And it's certainly worth looking online to learn more about these contracts. So the image on the right is from the George Street contract, and it's a really good example of the modular units, those that have been manufactured off-site, being lifted and lowered into place. And the other example shows the Wuhan hospital, and a clear example, and the Chinese are the leaders on this, of the significant reduction in time spent on site. Now, these are examples, these are notable contracts. These are contracts that would not fit the Thistle appetite. Our target market is UK contractors. Our target market is UK contractors, mainly up to 15 million turnover. And to give some examples of what we do see on MMC, a few months ago, we were asked to cover an MMC contract where modular buildings were being erected at a school, a fast provision of additional classroom space to increase social distancing. That was an isolated case, but at the time it felt like something that might become more common. So we may see some of that in the future. So looking at some of the insurance implications of modern methods of construction. So you've got mass production of parts and components, and that may encourage products built to a high standard or create an inherent issue that has a significant impact on a single development. Cranes are essential. Every image that we've seen about MMC has a crane in it. Modular units are lifted and lowered into place. So I would say check your own plant and hired-in plant limits. And what we have really is a 3D jigsaw of modular units. And repairs to some parts of that jigsaw may be complex. And how is a single unit repaired or replaced? A minor damage might result in a single unit that is effectively written off. So a disproportionate repair cost and then difficulties repairing a single unit within that 3D jigsaw of modular units. And usually the modular units are of lighter construction, so there's an increased risk of storm, escape of water due to push fittings, fire where construction includes a high proportion of combustible materials. And there is a concentrated transit risk with units transported on a flatbed and then craned into place. But overall, there may be less traffic to and from the site as there is less time on site. And less time on site is a positive. There's likely to be an improvement in health and safety. And flying factories, how exactly do you insure a flying factory? It could be an extension of the own plant definition, or it could be a separate property policy that's required. That is one to discuss with your insurer on a case-by-case basis. And again, I would encourage dialogue with your insurer. If you're aware your client is engaged in MMC, then you should be talking to your insurer to make sure they're aware of that. Okay, so that concludes modern methods of construction. And as I'm sure you'll be aware, we come to the end of the section. We run a poll. So the next poll should be ready about now. There we go. So do you think we will see more MMC? Simple yes, no answer. So 20 seconds, please cast your vote. Yes, we do. Okay, that is overwhelmingly in favour that we will see more MMC. And that's really interesting because as underwriters talking to brokers, it is quite rare for us to see MMC. But that's clearly something that we all need to be staying alert about and being right on top of that. So that's going to be really interesting as the economy develops and as we react to COVID. So thank you everybody for participating in those polls, and I'll just move to some final thoughts. So a few final thoughts. Uncertainty is likely to require contractors to reassess tenders and contract periods. I do believe that insurers will be sympathetic where existing contracts are disrupted by COVID, but it's those new contracts where I believe we all need to be proactive and discussing them and making sure the right contract price limit in your policy is set and also your maximum contract period. I do believe uncertainty has made a declaration option very attractive and see that as a cushion for uncertain times. Keep an eye out for the outcome of the planning for the future consultation, which one of the potential outcomes, more smaller developers been able to develop and a growth in house building. So that's a diary date for the end of October. That's when it closes and the conclusions will no doubt follow sometime thereafter. Stay alert, MMC may be happening soon. So look forward to talking about that in more detail as and when it happens and it's identified. But contractors do have a reputation for resilience and resourcefulness and continue to live up to this reputation. The Loughborough University research has shown the high levels of care and creativity that are applied to create COVID-safe environments. And finally, Thistle are here to help with an appetite that is aligned to the changes and one which continues to evolve. And I'll just conclude by saying thank you for listening and hand back to Christian for any questions that may have arisen.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Daniel. That was brilliant. So we'll move on to the Q&A now. The first one's from Jeremy Price. Can Daniel just remind us of the basic thrust of speculative building wording within contractors combined wording?
Yeah, thanks for that question, Jeremy. Generally, we are looking at 90 days, but 90 days from the construction of the last unit on the estate. So some wordings will be very specific to the individual unit, but we understand that a site will be active and there will be work ongoing. So our 90-day period kicks in from the practical completion, which relies on the policy wording and the definition, for a period of 90 days after the construction of the last house on the estate.
Excellent, thanks Daniel. This one's from Anonymous. You mentioned new builds being part of the appetite. Would you also like companies that are heavily involved in conversions, extensions, etc., mainly large contract sizes, but also the smaller ones?
Yeah, most definitely. We've been restricted to an extent to certain topics today, what we think is live and relevant. And I do believe there are other plans which will see easier permission for conversion of offices, redundant spaces effectively that can be reused for residential purposes. Permitted development, I think, is the term there for those. So people converting those, yet equally attractive. So absolutely, yeah, they're within appetite as well.
Thanks, Daniel. From Phil Walker, can Thistle write 100% bona fide subcontractor risks?
The answer is yes, we can. There will be times when we make a choice whether we do or don't, and it very much depends on the trade. So I think a private dwelling house builder is the one that's got the most potential to have 100% bona fides, and because that's an attractive trade and subject to checking on the procedures for engaging with bona fide subcontractors, very likely we would write that. If you're presenting to me a cladding contractor with 100% bona fides, I would struggle to accept that a specialist trade would not employ directly its own staff or utilise labour-only subcontractors. So the answer is yes, but as always, when an underwriter says yes, there's a yes but, and the but in this case is very much dependent on the trade.
Excellent. Okay, this one's from Sam Beda.
Sorry, Christian, I didn't catch the first bit of that question.
So this is from Sam Beda. Do you envisage a change to working patterns on construction sites, e.g. 7 days a week, or working during nights to compensate for reduced numbers of individuals allowed on the premises during coronavirus restrictions? I believe he's gone on. If I just go further down, further to the above, can you envisage any insurances issues resulting from changes in work patterns operations?
Okay, well, I think we talked earlier about building with community consent, and I think one of the elements of thinking about your community is when you build, when you fire up that excavator that makes all that noise, and at 7 AM on a Saturday morning, I would suggest that's not a great time to be doing that. But there are some practical issues, and there have to be some compromises made to make sure that people are employed and to maintain site safety. So I do think there will be a change in working patterns. We're all potentially going to have to experience that. And I also believe there has been some relaxation of the times when contracts can be operated in built-up areas. So just, there is this, let's just be pragmatic sometimes about these things, but there also will be safeguards built in to make sure that the community in the surrounding area are not adversely affected. And the second part of the question, Christian, if you can just remind me.
That's now been removed from the list. So I can't.
Okay, Sam, I do apologise, but if that can be recovered, I can answer that, or I can send you a separate response.
We'll come back on that one.
Okay.
This one's from Kieran McMahon. Will Thistle consider modular build manufacturing and install companies?
That is something that I would say we'd need to look at more closely on a specific detail of it. From a liability perspective, depending on the balance, because we are contractors, insurers, and that generally means we're looking at risks where the bias of exposure is on site. The MMC does clearly present a different balance there. So from a liability perspective, I would look at that in more detail. Some of the challenges would arise in connection with property, and our appetite is very much focused around liability, CAR, and plant. So if you're looking for us to do that, we'd certainly engage and discuss with you. From a property perspective, that is something where right now, as a contractor's insurer, we would not be able to help you.
Correct.
It would obviously be interesting as well. I mean, my perception is that most people separate those activities, so the construction is done by an independent company. But if people are now joining up to do the sort of cradle to grave of building it and installing it, that'd be an interesting development.
Excellent. Okay, from Gareth Hughes, are there any construction trades which, oh hang on, are there any construction trades which definitely do not sit within your appetite?
Well, there are. So if I just run through a few of those, asbestos removers would be something we've got no appetite for. Hot roofers, scaffolders, pure tunnelling contractors. What we have is an appetite that we believe allows us to deal with 99% of inquiries that we look at, and that's not necessarily 99% of the construction market, but those 4 trades are 4 headline examples of cases that we can't write. There will be others, but it'll be down to the subtleties of what they do, how they do it, where they do it, risk quality, for example. But if you're looking for trades, those 4 are the headline ones.
Okay, thanks, Daniel. From Adrian Price, do Thistle offer part products cover?
What a good question. Adrian, I'd love to have a separate conversation with you on that. So if that's one, if it's okay, if I could just defer that and come back to you separately on that. And I'll try and share that with the group as well, so if we can get some, we can publish that more widely.
Brilliant. Okay, guys, well, I think we're just about out of time now, so we're going to have to close. Those questions that we haven't answered, they'll be included in the write-up after this. Now, just to clarify, hopefully you've got a really good idea of what Thistle are about and what we can do. We encourage you guys to pick up the phone, engage with us. We don't shy away from having conversations, so please pick up the phone to Daniel or one of his team or myself, and we'll be pleased to help. And just on a final thought, thank you very much for such a great turnout. It's really pleasing to see.